Okay, very good. So welcome everybody to this this quarter's Smart Counsel webinar on funeral planning, green burials, and organ donation. Bob, why don't you get started? And everybody, if you want to ask Bob a question as he's going along, just type it in, or and we'll Bob will see it or I'll see it, and we'll answer the questions as we go along. Bob wants to kind of tailor his presentation to whatever you all want to hear about. So Bob, why don't you go ahead and get started, and we'll go from there.
Very good. Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Glad to be here with you. Yeah, I hit 50 years in funeral service this coming May, and 45 years in August of that being licensed. So wow. I guess that's a lot of experience in funeral service. A couple of topics that we were going to hit on, but obviously anything is open for questions. Anything funeral, I'm glad to talk about. I'm going to start with pre-arrangements. And what pre-arrangements are is putting your wishes down on paper and getting the information that you need available to your family members. It can be done through a funeral home. It can be done informally. You can fill out something in your home, just let everybody know where that information is, make it readily available. And I guess I would stress, put your wishes down on that too, because a number of times I have families that come in and I'm talking to children of somebody that's passed away, and I'll ask a question, do they want earth burial, for example, or cremation? And the children look at each other and say, we never talked about it. They don't know. And I think that's the biggest difficulty that a lot of families have, is that it's not a subject that people are willing to talk about or feel comfortable to talk about. And I've also heard parents say they've tried to talk about it to their children, and their children kind of shut them down. So if your parents bring it up, they need to talk, and you need to listen to them. Maybe something they want to get off their chest, and you know, although it may be uncomfortable, something that needs to be talked about. So the biggest part of pre-arrangements that people are interested in is if you have to prepay or want to prepay for your funeral expenses. I would stress it's not to be considered an investment. You can put money aside for funerals. It in most cases nowadays does not lock in the prices, because the interest rates and the inflation rates are doing wonderful things. So it's tough to plan for that from the funeral director's side. But a lot of time people need to spend down if they're on a Medicare situation, parents in a nursing home. It is a way that you can shelter assets, and the government will not attach those if it's in the proper account. It has to be irrevocable. So there are a couple of ways to do that. If you do not need to do it for a spend down situation, I usually am telling people, keep it in whatever investment that you have now. You're going to get a lot better rate of return that way than what I can provide you. Funeral homes have to abide by the prudent man rule. We cannot lose your money, which means we don't get a lot of return on that money. It will be safe, but it's not going to grow much. So there are a couple of ways to deal with the funds when you're doing that. Most funeral homes use a trust, and there is the New England Funeral Trust, which is actually through our Funeral Directors Association. And the good thing about going through that is that they have already vetted all their paperwork and all their rules and regulations with the different boards and committees and things in the state that would be affected. So the Banking Commission has looked at it, the Insurance Commission has looked at it, anybody that has a regulation, they have looked at those and made sure that it complies with everything. Tax-wise, they look at that too. You can also put your money in insurance products, and insurance, there are 3 or 4 ways to handle that. The easiest is to just assign your benefits to a funeral home, which means at the time when you pass away, you have signed a form saying the funeral bill will be paid first out of my insurance, and then whatever is left will be dispersed among your beneficiaries. That I think is the easiest and fairest. That is not a good way to shelter your assets if you are going on public assistance. In that case, they are going to want you to change the beneficiary of the policy. And if you're trying to shelter it, you can do an irrevocable change of beneficiary. That means that once you've assigned it to the funeral home, you cannot change it back. And that's what the state is looking for, that you're not going to put money in and then transfer it to somebody else afterwards. They want to make sure it's saved just for your funeral expenses. The least, well, I would not recommend this way to do it is to change the ownership of the policy. And in that case, you are actually giving the policy in its entirety to the funeral home. That creates a few problems in that if something happens to the funeral home, you've given it to somebody that may not exist anymore or been bought by somebody else. If there are encumbrances on the insurance, if you've taken loans on it, that has to be disclosed to the funeral home so that they're not planning on those funds. And also the funeral home is not going to want to pay for those insurance policies while you're still alive. It wouldn't make sense for us to pay for a policy to pay ourselves. So you would be responsible for keeping up all the payments on those policies. There are a couple of ways to set up. I'm going to go back to the trust accounts again. So those seem to be the most popular and the easiest to deal with. There are a couple of ways to set those up. Trust accounts can be either guaranteed or not guaranteed. And that's where I was talking about the interest that it earns keeping up with inflation. Most funeral homes now are not going to guarantee those accounts. So it works like a savings account. If there's excess money in that account at the time when you pass away, that's going to be returned to your estate. If there's not enough money in the trust at the time when you pass away, you or your family is going to get a bill for the balance of what would be due. And most funeral homes are going to talk to you about that ahead of time so that you're not surprised by a large bill that you weren't expecting. You should be getting a fully itemized statement of what is in the account, the current costs, and the balance due either way, or at least it should be talked about. Let's see. The other way that trust can be set up, not another way, but it's another issue in setting up trusts. They can be revocable accounts or irrevocable accounts, or depending on your English, revocable or irrevocable. A revocable account is good if you're not in public assistance. It lets you control the account. If you were to decide you want to change something in the account, you have the right to do it. You can change the entire funeral arrangements and you have that power. If it's not revocable or irrevocable, then it's supposed to stay exactly as is. The funeral home is legally obligated to provide what you have paid for, or what your parent or whoever made the account has put in there and arranged for. Generally, there are two people that can change a pre-need account. It's the person who the account is for, that's called the beneficiary, or the person who makes the pre-arrangements, and that's generally called the buyer. So you can make pre-arrangements for a parent or brother or sister or child, whatever the case may be. Strange thing, you don't even have to tell them that you're doing that, which is not necessarily a good idea, but you can do that. Normally, I would say that you would want to share whatever you have arranged with your family. And it's always good to have somebody who can back you up and make decisions. If a parent makes them for themselves, they should designate one of their children or some other relative or family friend, whoever it might be that they trust, to be able to make decisions in the case there is something that decision has to be made on. say you picked out a casket and 20 years later, that casket is not available. The funeral home is going to give the next of kin the right to decide what casket to use. And we would normally provide you with a list of the caskets that are the same value, price, and description. And then you would decide which one you would want. Obviously, if you're the only one that can make changes in that and you have passed on, it creates a little bit of a problem. I mean, we will try to find the closest next of kin to go on and do that.
Is that something they would designate, Bob, when they're making the prearrangement, a person to make?
I usually try to ask and have people tell me who, and I write down their name and contact information so that if there is a problem. Generally, if you're not making prearrangements, there's a person called the informant on a death certificate. That's who the information comes from. And that's usually our contact person. They're the ones that make those decisions. Although families most do well by working together and make decisions in a group amount. A thing to keep in mind, if you are going on public assistance, you can prepay your funeral in full. You're also allowed to have a separately identified bank account of no more than $1,500, which you can set aside and use for whatever you wish. You can buy flowers with it. If you have a relative that has to fly in from out of the area, you can use it for airfare. You can use it for a collation or gathering afterwards. Anything funeral related is acceptable. And you should just make sure the bank puts on that for funeral expenses. So that way, if you have to prove that what that account is for to Medicaid or transitional assistance, you're able to show them the bank book that it was set up for that purpose. And that's principal only that can't exceed the 1,500. So any interest it earns can stay in there and it can grow and you can use whatever's in the account. You just can't add more than $1,500 to that. One thing also you should know that if you make pre-arrangements with a funeral home, you have 10 days from the day that you sign the paperwork that you can change that or cancel it for any reason whatsoever. The thought was if somebody was going door to door and selling funeral policies or funeral expenses or trusts, and you looked into them later on and found out they weren't a company that you wanted to be dealing with, you're allowed to cancel. No reason whatsoever. You just say, I want my money back, and the bank has to return everything to you. So there's a lot of paperwork involved in setting up these trusts. And if you feel like you didn't have a chance to read everything, you don't have to get nervous because you do have 10 days. You can run it by your lawyer, whatever you wish, have every family member read it. And if there's something you don't like, you have an option. You can get out of that. Interest that's earned on these accounts stays in the accounts. That's what we try to use to offset inflation. I did have one person that wanted to take a trip, I think it was to Israel, and she wanted to take all the interest out of the account. Legally, could she do that? Yes, but it does break the agreement with the funeral home. So it's as if you were starting from scratch again. So it is meant to be something that you put aside and you don't touch. While the beneficiary of the account is alive, the person that it's for, they can make changes or the buyer can make changes. Those changes have to be in writing. So say you want to add another day's newspaper notice, or you wanted to add a limousine, or whatever it might be, as long as you put it in writing and say, dear funeral director, please add XYZ to my trust account, that's fine. They want to make sure that the changes that are happening are not coming from the funeral home making you change things. It's that something that you wish to do. So on the converse side, if there are any changes at the funeral home, if we were to sell, if we were to close or go out of business, even if we change the bank, you have to be notified ahead of time of that fact with your options, and then you can decide whether that would be something that would change the account and you could cancel it, or if you want to stay with, say, a successor funeral home or successor bank. And we would have to notify you in writing of that, obviously.
Bob, we have a question. If the cost is not locked in when you're making prearrangements, what's the advantage of doing that?
The advantage is if you want to take some of that burden off of your children, they would have less to worry about. And also, you've obviously determined what goes into that cost. So it's a kind of a written document of what you want to have. The other benefit would be is that it puts something aside that is available to your family or your children. If you don't open up something with your family, say another trust, or put your children's name on your bank account or something, they don't have access to your funds at the time of the funeral. And there are certain things that have to be paid right away. At our funeral home, we require families pay the cemetery and any church or clerical costs, clergy costs. Other things we can deal with. We do ask for deposit, but if you're waiting for insurance or something like that, most funeral homes work with you on those sort of things.
Yeah,
But
you run into that a lot, Bob.
If you prepay it, there's money there to cover, and okay, you might have a little balance due, but you won't have to come up with the whole thing right away.
Right. If you have money in a trust, and your family can get access to it right away, not the type of trust Bob's talking about, but the estate planning trust we set up, that's fine. But if your estate is going through probate and it takes a couple of months for a personal representative to be appointed, and your bank account was in your individual name, that money is not accessible to anybody. So we do have families who come to us and say, I have no access to money to pay these expenses. And the answer is, someone's going to have to advance that money and get reimbursed once access is available. But if you prepay, I see the advantage of that. At least there's some of that there that's already been put towards the funeral expenses.
It's taking some stress off your family.
Yeah. So Bob, if someone was going to prearrange their funeral, or fast forward, they've passed away and their kids are having to arrange it at that time, what are the different decisions that have to be made?
Well, the first one probably is timing. If it's not prearranged, there are a lot of decisions you have to make. Is it going to be a funeral at a church, or at the funeral home, or at the cemetery, or no funeral service? I mean, I'm not saying you have to have a funeral service. Is it going to be burial or cremation? And if it's burial, is there a cemetery lot already, or is that something you have to go look for and purchase a grave? If it's cremation, what's going to be done with the ashes? Are they going to be buried? Are they going to be scattered? Because the disposition doesn't end at the cremation. Something has to be done with the cremated remains. So that's a decision. There are a lot of different things, like if you want newspaper notices, what's going to go in the newspaper notices. If you're having traditional services, you have to pick out a casket. And if it's burial, you have to pick out it's called an outer burial container. It's a concrete container that a casket goes in a grave. It can seal, that's called a burial vault. And sometimes people use that term generically for anything. But if it doesn't seal, it's a grave liner, and they're a little less expensive. A lot of questions like, what are you going to do for clothing? Somebody's been in a nursing home for 5 years. They may not have a lot of clothing there that you would want to use for if you're having viewing. Other things, I mean, private viewing, public viewing. You're going to have embalming, not have embalming. So there are a lot of different decisions that have to be made, and if none of it's been addressed ahead of time, it can make you feel a little overwhelmed, I think, when we sit down and start asking you all these questions.
So even if you don't prearrange, it's good to at least think about those things and maybe write them down for your family at least, or have a conversation with your family about it. And I'll talk a little later about how we help people document those wishes. But yeah, there's a lot to think about, and a lot of permutations, and things that follow from that, right? So
exactly.
We have a question about how hard is it to find a green burial, and does it have to be arranged ahead of time because it's less common? I know you're going to talk about green burials eventually, Bob, so.
Yeah, I can probably segue to that and then come back to the other thing. So that doesn't create any problems for me.
Sure.
There are actually 4 forms of disposition. There's burial, obviously in a cemetery, and a subset of that is a green burial. I'll come back to that in just a second. There's cremation, which I think we all know what that is. It's reduction of the body by heat. There's what's called alkaline hydrolysis, and these next 2 are not common, but they are starting to be talked about. That is reduction of the body by liquid, by reducing the body with chemicals to its basic elements, and then drying the liquid out of that. So you still get a powder like you do with cremated remains. And then the last, which you may have seen in the newspaper recently, it's been talked about a couple of times by our state legislature. It's called human composting. And that is taking your body, not burying it to have it return to the elements, but having it return to the elements above ground in a container, so that when it's all over, you are returned with a box of actually earth. Is the best way to explain it. That creates a problem, however, because the bones do not compost, and that takes a long time. The regular human composting, you're talking months, and depending upon your thoughts and what you want to do, that may be a longer term solution. But going back to green burial, so that subset, green burial is the burial of a person in the most environmentally friendly way. So you're using generally no embalming, although there are environmental embalming fluids that are available, and some companies will, or some cemeteries will let you use those. Most don't. Most say no embalming. If you have a casket, it has to be something that can decompose easily. So either all wood, and even that, a truly green burial would want to try to avoid that, because there's the manufacturing costs of cutting down the trees to make the casket. So you might be in a shroud or a pouch or a woven casket of some sort, again, more like a pouch, and you're buried in earth. And once the burial takes place, there's not usually any identification of the grave. So some of the green cemeteries use a small marker, and then you use GPS to locate exactly where your grave is. Others would just give you a map and you'd have to pace off. It's interesting. I have been asked about green burial, and the last time I looked, the only cemetery in the area that offered that was in New Hampshire. Now, granted, that was probably 4 or 5 years ago, but it is taking on a life of its own. And there are a couple of cemeteries in Boston that are starting to promote green burial. The Gardens at Gethsemane in West Roxbury is one, and Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge is another. Be aware, just because it says it's green burial does not necessarily mean it's less expensive. The cemetery costs that I have seen are more expensive. And some of that, like with Mount Auburn, they don't have a lot of space left. And, so you're paying for supply and demand, I guess you would say. Also, the thing about Mount Auburn is that you have to arrange for that ahead of time. So you would need to purchase the green grave while you're alive, and then it could be used at the time of your death. And they would give you all their regulations for that. I think funeral directors generally are fine with the concept. It's just a different form of burial. You can still have a service at the cemetery if you went there, or you could have something at the funeral home before you went to the cemetery. I did find there's a very good website of the cemeteries that are available that have green burial spaces. It's called greenburialma.org. And they update are in the process of updating that continually. So if you find a cemetery in your town and they say it's not listed there, and the cemetery tells you they do green burials, you can send an email to this website, and they will add it to their site. So I was surprised there are actually a pretty good number of cemeteries, Worcester and West, that offer that. And it's common there. Just a little difficult in the Boston area to find those cemeteries that allow that.
Is it because you need more space for the green burials? Do the graves have to be spaced farther apart, or what's the logic that it's in the more rural parts of the state?
I think they do have more space. The cemeteries in the Boston area, if they precinct, sorry about that, the concrete container, some of them are actually putting those into the graves ahead of time in a whole area so that they don't lose any space between burials. So that whole section would not be available. Some of the cemeteries, they're a little nervous about liability in that, because if you have a burial and eventually the grave collapses or settles, there's more maintenance. They have to go back and resod or fill the grave to keep it level. They don't want people breaking ankles or tripping or anything like that. So also, if they have to drive heavy equipment over the graves, they don't want to collapse them. So graves are usually not done by hand anymore. They're done by backhoe. Lawnmowers are large driving things, so they have more weight.
I see.
So I think they're a little nervous about that, especially in the Boston area. They can set them aside in a more rural area and not have that worry.
So back to the question, how hard is it to find it? Well, we answered that question. You can find them.
You can find them, and this is getting more and more common.
Yeah, and then does it have to be arranged ahead of time because it's less common? So unless you're looking for a green burial in one of those desirable cemeteries close to Boston, I suppose there's less green burial spots overall than there are traditional burial spots.
Correct.
So do you see people arranging green burials?
I have not had anybody prearrange a green burial yet, no.
Okay.
No. But I would suggest, if that's something you're interested in, you would want to talk to the cemetery in your area and see if they do have regulations that you have to buy the grave ahead of time, just for safety's sake.
So someone's asking, what if it's cold? What if it's winter? I think they're saying at the time of the burial, how do they handle that? That's a good question.
Burials go on year round. If you get up north, and even this is changing, they would put off burials until the spring. The cemeteries have a tomb, and people are put in the tomb, and then once the ground is thawed, they have burial week, and everybody is interred during that 1 or 2 weeks. I have not run into that in the Boston area. We have burials year round. You might, if it's really cold, we sometimes suggest that the families have their services at the funeral home or indoors, and then maybe drive by the grave. If you're talking 0 degrees, although we're hardy New Englanders and we stand outside for 5 or 10 minutes for the committal service a lot of times.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Someone says they're still unclear what a green burial is. So, my understanding of a green burial is something that's environmentally friendly, right? Because
Correct.
if you have a regular burial, you have the concrete in the ground, you have the casket, sometimes metal caskets in the ground, which don't, degrade. And then you have embalming, which can, is chemicals that eventually go into the ground too. So the green burials eliminate all of that environmental impact, I think.
Right. It's trying to create the most environmentally friendly alternatives.
Right. So, and some people, I was doing a little reading on it, and people have said, cremation, although it seems more environmentally friendly, there's still the whatever the gases that are discharged when you're, you know,
Mhm.
cremating someone, and the power that it takes to run the whatever.
Right, they are run by gas. Most of the crematories now, though, environmentally are pretty clean.
Okay.
They have to have scrubbers on the stacks, and there are different levels of combustion that they can go back and not emit a lot of pollution.
Yeah, so I think if you're interested in this, there's so much out there about it now because it's becoming popular. There was an article in the Globe recently. I think there was an article in the Washington Post recently about it. So maybe
Yep.
when we post this on the website, we can post some of those articles too. Some of them are not accessible for free, but we'll try. But just Google it, you know, you'll find so much. There's another question: has human composting been approved in Massachusetts?
No, it hasn't. It's under discussion, but the
Okay.
lawmakers are not comfortable with that thought and don't know what to do with it. Doesn't fit under burial, doesn't really fit under cremation.
Bob, are you going to talk about the veteran cemeteries at all?
I didn't have that there, but I can.
Okay, just a quick mention about how someone what happens if you're a veteran and you want to be buried, or who can be buried in the veteran cemeteries. That's probably a good way to start, right?
Yep, any honorably discharged veteran is eligible for burial in the national cemeteries. There are 2 in Massachusetts. There's one in Chicopee, I believe it is. I have not been there yet. It's kind of far from here. And the National Cemetery at Bourne. The burials are free to all veterans. They provide the grave. They provide the opening and closing of the grave. They will provide the concrete liner that goes in the grave, and they mark the grave with a bronze plaque. So it saves quite a bit of money for a veteran. It's just, they're not always right near where you are.
So if someone died around here, they would pay for the
Mhm.
casket and whatever.
And funeral
the
services.
funeral service, and then the transportation down to Bourne, because that's quite a
Mhm.
distance. How does that work?
I haven't heard of any funeral homes, and this doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but in our area that charge extra to go to Bourne,
Okay,
we're right within the 75-mile radius of the cemetery. So
Okay. Very good. And my uncle is buried in Bourne, and you know, it's a beautiful service that they do there. I don't know if you have to select it. I wasn't part of the arrangements, but you know, you can have the honor guard, you can have the flag on the casket that they
Mhm.
then fold up and give to the family and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, the funeral director has to arrange for the honor guard.
Okay. So, and spouses, I think you said the spouses can be buried there too. Right?
Yes, they can.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
Let's see. Oh, what about any cost for veteran spouse burial? Oh, so do they cover those things that you said were free for the veteran? Does that also go for the spouse?
They're free for the spouse too.
Very nice. Okay.
It is. Our government got that one right.
Yeah, that's a really nice thing. Okay, so didn't mean to get you off track, Bob.
No, the only thing, excuse me, that I have left is talking about the right of disposition. And that's who has the authority to make decisions when you pass away. Excuse me. You probably will be surprised to find out that Massachusetts is the only state in the United States that does not have a right of disposition law. Other 49 states all spell out exactly who and what order people make decisions. The Funeral Directors Association is trying to get that dealt with, but for some reason, they're a little hesitant to spell that out. But what the other states do, apparently, if I'm looking off, I'm reading what is most common. The most common right of disposition, first, is a person designated by the decedent as the right to have control. So if you signed a document, say, I want my son to make all arrangements, that would be the first person. After that, it's a surviving spouse, surviving children, surviving parents, surviving siblings, so that brothers and sisters, obviously, grandparents, guardians, personal representatives, And then finding any other relatives, whoever's the closest in relationship would have that right. So we're hoping to get that into law, but not yet.
That's interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about one way we can address that.
Sure.
Okay. So
that's what I had in my list.
that's great. Thank you, Bob. Anybody else have any questions for Bob?
I'll be here to the end, so you can ask them then too.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't see any more questions for you, Bob. So Liz, why don't you go ahead with your presentation. Liz is going to talk to us about organ donation.
Okay, thank you very much. And I learned a lot, Bob. Thank you.
You're welcome, Liz.
I'm thrilled to be here today talking to you about organ donation and registering as an organ and tissue donor. When I talk to individuals or groups, I always like to start off by asking a question. If you or a loved one needed an organ transplant to save your life or their life, would you hope there was one available? Now, most people say, oh, yes, absolutely. I would, like myself or my loved one to survive. But only about 50% of the country are registered. And you have to wonder, why is that? Sometimes people just haven't thought about it. Other times they have misconceptions and they believe things that they've heard which perhaps aren't true. So I'm here to hopefully dispel some of the myths out there. Out of everybody that dies in America, only about 4% of all deaths occur in a way they could be a potential donor. So it's a very, very small minority. Now, why is this? Well, in order to be an organ donor, you have to die in very specific circumstances, usually in intensive care, on a ventilator, legally brain dead. So it's not, you're not in a coma, you're not in a vegetative state, you haven't died outside of the intensive care on a ventilator. So it's a very small percentage. In fact, you're far more likely to require an organ donor, to be an organ donor recipient yourself than to die in those very small circumstances. Very briefly, why I love to talk about this. My sister T, I wear her badge. At the age of 50, she had no significant medical history. She developed a cough. She had never smoked. And she went to the doctors and she had tests. And she was told she had 2 lung diseases, one so rare she was the 8th person in the world diagnosed with it, and was told eventually she would need an organ, a lung transplant to survive. When she was 52, she was sick enough to get onto the organ transplant waiting list. And almost 2 years to the day, she died waiting. And a lot of people do die waiting. There's 22 people that die every day waiting. And I tell you about T because T could be any one of us. Could be your best friend, could be your child's coach, could be you. It can happen at any time. So what are the reasons maybe you haven't decided to register as an organ donor? Age is the biggest one that people come up and say, Liz, I'm far too old. Nobody would want my parts. And I say, oh, yes, they might do. The oldest cornea donor was 107 when she died and restored someone's sight. I mean, that's incredible. And the oldest organ donor, he was 95 when he died and with his liver gave somebody else the gift of life. I mean, incredible. Other people think, I have medical conditions. I've had cancer. I've got high blood pressure. I'm diabetic. Doesn't matter. This is not a medical question. This is, when you register, you are just showing your intent. If it was possible, I would like to help others. I would like to transform lives with tissue and cornea donation, or I would like to save up to 8 lives with organ donation. It's not up to us to decide if our organs or tissues are good. That's up to the transplant team, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. When I talk to driving schools, 90 years. They're 17, the oldest one was 107. So, and by then, leaps and bounds of progress in the medical field. So it's not a medical question. So you should never rule yourself out. The fantastic thing is anyone can register over the age of, well, 18 for legal consent. But if you can, when you get your driver's permit, you can register, but your parents will have the ultimate decision until you turn 18. Religion is another question. Oh, I don't think my religion would approve. Well, in fact, all major religions allow you to make that choice or actively say it's a great choice. So I would suggest that you speak to your rabbi, your priest, your vicar, your minister, whoever, and get their take on it, because pretty sure they will say it's an incredible thing, an incredible gift to do. Other things that prevent people from registering, they will tell me that they saw on TV, so it must be true, somebody was left in the ER to die, so a little girl could get a transplant. It's TV, it isn't real life, and unfortunately, people remember that. When you go to the emergency room, the doctors in the emergency room, they've taken an oath. They do everything in their power to save your life. They have nothing to do with transplants. Their hospital might not even do transplants, but they have nothing to do with transplants. Their job is to save your life and your life alone. They don't think of other people there. Cost, there's no cost to the donor family. All the costs are paid for by the insurance of the recipient's family or the recipient. I've also been told, oh, only rich people get organ donations. And they think because someone famous has received an organ transplant, that it was because they were famous. No. If you need an organ transplant, then your age, your body build, your blood type, your tissue type, your location goes into a computer. If somebody has died in those circumstances and is a potential donor, their details, location, build, age, tissue type, blood type, go into the computer. The computer matches the best match for those organs. Nothing to do with celebrity status or anything like that. I'm also asked the question, what if I want to leave my body to science? Great question. Best to ask the facility that you're planning to leave your body to. Many will say, if you happen to be in that 3-4% and you can donate your organs, then yes, do that, and then we'll take the rest of your body. But that, if you check with them, they will let you know if you can register or not. Most importantly, how do I register? Super simple. Registerme.org takes you less than a minute and it's done. It won't give you the heart on your license, but you are in the system. It doesn't matter that the heart's not on your license, you are in the system. If you have an iPhone, it takes even less time, 30 to 45 seconds. You automatically have a little red heart on your health app, which is already installed. And if you scroll down a little bit, it's there and you just fill out a couple of details. And most importantly, let your family know. If you happen to be in that very small number that could be an organ donor, and you haven't registered, your family will be asked. And that's really tough to hear, just like Bob's families. And it's the first time they're hearing the questions. So it's so important to let your family know your wishes. And that way it's not left to them to decide. So communication is key. And I think I've covered most of the normal questions I asked, but happy to answer any others.
You can also indicate on your, well, I should say, how do you get the red heart on your driver's license?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So if you haven't already got your license, either register online or when you go into the DMV or the AAA, wherever you get your license, the very first question that you're asked on the form is, do you want to register as an organ and tissue donor? You have to answer yes or no. You can't leave it blank, or the staff will ask you. As a volunteer for New England Donor Services, I also am ambassador for a AAA in Westwood and a DMV in Attleboro. So I pop in every month and educate the staff. So if somebody says to them, which happens frequently, I'm too old, or I've got high blood pressure, the staff now can say, oh, that's fine, anyone can register. So they're now being educated by a team of volunteers on how to answer the public when they ask that question. So absolutely, if you're going to the DMV tomorrow and you want to register, fantastic. If you aren't renewing your license for a while and would like to register, then please do it tonight. Honestly, it takes less than a minute. And then it's done. You're in the system and it's good.
Give us that website again, Liz.
It's registerme.org.
And what kind of questions do you need to answer?
You will have, I think it's name, address, last four of your social, just in case there are more than one one person at the same address with the same name. I think that might be pretty much it. It's very simple. It's not a complicated process. And again, I asked the question at the end as well. If you or a loved one needed an organ transplant to save your life, would you hope someone else had registered for you or your loved one? So, but if you can't be an organ donor, you can be a tissue and cornea donor. That's far more common. And it's incredible how many lives you can transform, up to 75 lives. Makes such a difference. Burn victims. And yeah, that's another thing. Somebody said, oh, well, skin, they're very worried how much. They take about this much, and it's from the back, from the lower back, and that's all. But with that, they can stretch it. They can do so much grafting after mastectomies or burns. There's dental implants that they use, ACL surgery. If you can't use your own ACL, then they will use a donor. And when you do the operation, or when you have the operation, or your child, my son had a football injury, you sign a form. If they're unable to use yours, you will accept a donor. So there's so many different ways you can transform lives. And it's not only their life, it's the life of their families, their friends. They can then grow up, get married, have children, this kind of thing. So, I mean, incredible what you can do.
We have one question, Liz, which is, what is the time delay before the body is buried if someone is going to be an organ donor? So how long does that the process take?
I believe there's not much of a delay at all. I'm sure Bob can answer that.
Yeah, usually it's about a day, rarely more than 2 days.
and I can, feel free to put more questions in the Q&A, but I can talk a little bit about full body donation, which, because I've had some clients who have done that. And both of you correct me if my understanding isn't correct, but in my experience, they've arranged that donation directly with the medical school who they want to donate their body to. And, there's an agreement process you go through with them. And the ones I've seen, the medical school will, one of them will just bury your body, cremate, I believe, and
Cremate, exactly.
bury your cremated remains in a cemetery that they have.
In Tewksbury.
Okay, or I don't know if they would return the cremated remains to the family if you want them to.
They will return the whole body to the family for cremation if you wish.
Okay.
Yeah. There are 4 medical schools, just not to jump on you,
No, go ahead.
Harvard, Boston University, Tufts, and UMass Medical Center in Worcester are the 4 medical schools in Massachusetts that accept full body donations.
Okay. Now, my understanding is they can't guarantee you they're going to accept you, right? Because if they have
Correct.
too many at the time, they might decline. Do they then give it to another school, or do they just decline?
No, then the family has to have a backup plan.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, so if that interests you, you can, I'm sure there's a lot of information available on the medical schools websites that you can
There is.
look at. Great. Any other questions for Liz? No? Okay, great. Thank you, Liz. So let me just kind of piggyback on what Bob and Liz have talked about with a couple of things related to the legal documents we create. In terms of organ donation, that's always a question we ask our clients when we are creating healthcare documents for them. So when I say healthcare documents, I mean a healthcare proxy, which is the document where you name someone to make healthcare decisions for you, and a living will, which is an expression of wishes about end-of-life care. In both of those documents, if you want to be an organ donor, we will put a statement in the document. In the healthcare proxy, it's a statement that says, I authorize my healthcare agent to give permission, for organ donation for me. And in the living will, it's just an expression of wishes about, it's your wish to donate your organs to benefit another person, or for research purposes, if you want to say that as well. I don't know, Liz, if you have any experience about research, organs being used for research.
I don't.
Okay. So I'm not sure how that comes about, or if it has to be like we were talking about the full body donation made arrangements in advance.
I was a nucleus for the New England Eye Bank when organ donations were just starting. And they would accept all corneas or all eyes. And if you weren't of a sufficient quality for transplant, they would be used for research or for teaching ophthalmologists or optometrists, whichever the doctor does the surgery. So they kind of weren't wasted, they were used.
Okay, yeah, also a valuable thing. So we make your wishes clear, which is helpful, right? So if your family is wondering whether you have ever thought about this and want to be an organ donor, the documents will confirm your wish. They'll confirm that you want to be. If you don't want to be an organ donor, we don't include anything in the documents. And then we encourage people to back that up by putting it on their license. But Liz, I'll also make note of this website and to tell people they can do that independently of, the registry of motor vehicles. Let's see. After you do this, after you put those wishes in your healthcare proxy or your living will, you should give those documents to your family, especially to the healthcare agents who are named in your healthcare proxy, because you want them, to have those documents and know that they've been named as your decision maker. So if an emergency arises and somebody contacts them to make a healthcare decision, they're not surprised. And the document should also go to your physicians, so they know who your healthcare agents are. I don't know, maybe you two know, I don't think a physician would make a decision about organ donation just because they see it in a document,
No.
They have to with the family's permission. Yeah. So it's
Mhm.
just basically to let people know that you're open to that.
If you have made the decision to register, then you are registered. So if the family, then they know that's what you want.
Mhm.
So
Right.
they can, they will, that is legal consent, so they will take that.
Got it. Okay. In terms of funeral arrangements, we have a separate document that we call a directive as to remains where we document people's wishes about burial or cremation or anything else they might want. A lot of people say, I want to put this in my will. And sometimes I see older wills that have, burial instructions in them, but in my opinion, that's the wrong place for that.
Oh.
People shouldn't be like in a big hurry to read your will the moment you pass away, right? And
True.
typically that doesn't happen, until after the funeral. So that might be too late, right? If you want to be cremated, you don't want to have them bury you and then figure that out. So we put it in a separate document, separate from the will, and we encourage people when they do that to give that document to their family members. So it's kind of like the note Bob was talking about, where you write down your wishes, except it's a little more formal. We ask you things like, do you want to be buried or cremated? If you want to be buried, where do you want to be buried? Do you have a plot already? If people have prearranged their funeral or intend to prearrange their funeral, we'll make a note of that in the document, so the family will know, oh, I need to go talk to Bob because mom said she prearranged her funeral with Folsom, or she intended to, so it kind of has the trail of breadcrumbs for the family to find the information they need. And then if you want to be cremated, we'll ask you, do you want your cremated remains scattered where? Do you want them given to certain family members? Some people want their remains combined with their spouse, in an urn. Some people want it combined with their pet's ashes. People have all kinds of wishes. So you want to document them, and then you want to make sure that the family or whoever's going to carry out those wishes knows that they exist. And I will point out that there is a law in Massachusetts that came into effect with the Uniform Probate Code in 2012 that says that a personal representative who's named in your will, so that's the executor of your will, now we call them personal representatives, that person has the legal authority to carry out written instructions about the disposition of your remains, even before the court appoints them as personal representative. So if you have those written instructions and you have a will that names a personal representative, that person has authority to carry out those directions. So Bob, that I think,
Good.
if I were arguing, in a court of law, I would say that kind of trumps your thing, your comment that Massachusetts has no law about, disposition instructions. I think that's it. So it's not a family member, but it could be anybody, whoever you name as personal representative, as long as you write down
As
those.
long as you name them, right?
Yes, you have to
Yeah.
name them. You have to have a will that names a personal rep, and you have to have written instructions, which is, another reason we encourage our clients to write down their instructions so that they can be carried out. And I think that's especially true if you have instructions that you feel like might be objectionable to your family. Maybe everyone's buried in Forest Hills, but you want to be cremated, or you want to go to the Veterans Cemetery in Bourne. If it's something that you don't think your family would just automatically do, make sure it's spelled out for them so they know. And I think, this is not a topic that people talk about a lot, but it should be something that that you ask your family members about, ask your parents about, ask your siblings about, because, anything can happen at any time, and you want people to, to be laid to rest however they want to be, right? So the more we know, the more we can carry out their wishes and honor them in that way. So I think that's everything I wanted to Oh, Bob, let's talk for a moment about burial plots, and then we have a couple questions, but we were
Mhm.
talking before we started about, oh, the family has a burial plot at Forest Hills. I want to go there. Well, you might want to go there, but what has to happen in order for you to be able to go there? You need to have the right to be buried there, right?
Yep. Every cemetery has a little bit different rules and regulations. Generally, if a spouse is buried there, the surviving spouse, assuming there's space, has the right to be buried with that deceased spouse. Some cemeteries, if you are a family member and you can prove it, they will let you be buried there. Others want the signatures of everybody, say a parent, and they want all the children's signatures, not just one, they want everybody. The easiest way to create or to take care of any problems is to go to the cemetery and put reservations on the grave. So you have 4 graves. Okay, grave 1 is for so-and-so, grave 2 is for their spouse, grave 3 is for another person, grave 4 is for the other person. And then the cemetery has to bury those people in that grave.
So who can make those reservations? Do you go to Open Table and you say, I want to be buried in?
I would go to the cemetery and ask what their rules and regulations are.
So it
to
must
do
be
that.
the owner of the, I would expect
The owner of the lot.
Right,
It's easy if it's not been used, obviously whoever bought the grave.
yeah,
Or if there's one spouse buried there, the surviving spouse would have the say. It's easy in that case. When you start getting further away from the person that purchased the grave,
yeah,
it gets a little murky.
yeah, definitely. So, yeah, it's good to be clear. So if you want to be buried somewhere, you have to figure out who owns the lot, you know, do you have some right to be there, and who can confirm that for the cemetery. Let's see. Oh, here, one more question. Does the registration have to specify organ versus cornea donor? Can you decide what you want to donate, I guess?
I know on the health app, Apple Health app, it doesn't. I don't think it does on the online registration, but you may be able to call.
I know through the organ bank, when the person has died and they are talking to the family, the family can restrict what is taken, what isn't.
Okay.
So I've had families say we've allowed this, but not allowed that. So I don't know about ahead of time, Liz, when you're dealing with people, the registry or whatever, but at the time of death, I know they do ask about that.
Well,
That is
usually,
an option.
yeah. When I'm talking to people, usually when people register, they're happy to help and save as many as they can.
Mhm.
You know, but they might have said, "Oh, well, my eyesight's bad, so I don't want them taking my eyes or my corneas." But then when you explain that, you know, perhaps with glasses, your eyesight would be able to help someone, they're like, "Oh, yeah, okay." So again, I try and say, perhaps leave it up to the doctors, because you don't know in certain years' time, you know, the medical advances.
True. Yeah, that's a
So,
good.
Mhm.
yeah.
Bob, do you have any experience with burial at sea?
Once or twice, yes. If
Has
you
that-
are a veteran, it's a lot easier than if you're just a civilian.
Okay.
The last casket we buried, we had to send down to Newport, Rhode Island, and there was a couple of months. And then the next ship that went out, the casket went out on that ship. There's a lot of regulations about the casket has to be banded. You have to have certain holes drilled into the casket so it will actually sink. It has to be weighted. It's a lot easier if you wish to bury ashes at sea. If you wish to bury an urn, the captain of the ship has to report the latitude and longitude where your ashes were put overboard. That's pretty much it. You have to be 3 miles out into international waters.
Okay. Yeah, I have seen at an estate planning attorneys conference once, there was someone had a
Mhm.
table set up who did burials, I guess, private burials at sea.
Yep, there's a company down the Cape that does that.
Okay, yeah, so that's an interesting thing for anybody who's, interested in that or enjoys being out on the water and wants to be there permanently. Okay, we're a little early, but I've run out of questions, I think. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Bob and Liz, if there's anything else you want to talk about, feel free.
The only other thing I was going to say, for organs, and we ran across this just a couple of weeks ago, heart valves. You don't have to be in a hospital. You can, if you die at home or something. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. They will still take heart valves a certain number of hours after your death.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk, Bob. I think I've heard you talk about this before, but if someone dies in the hospital,
Mhm.
those are kind of taken care of for the family,
Yep.
they know what to do. But what if someone dies suddenly at home? Is there anything special that the family needs to know? I assume you just call 911 and go from there.
If you're on hospice care, you have to call a hospice. They will take care of everything from that.
Okay.
If you're not on hospice care, you do have to call 911. The police have to come, and the medical examiner has to waive jurisdiction.
Okay. And then from there, would you go to the home or the
We
funeral
go-
director?
Yep, we go to the home.
Okay.
You have a question asking if you can post the link for the recording.
Oh, yes. The link for the recording, we will email to everybody who's on the call or on the webinar tonight, and we'll also post it on our website. So you'll be able to go to the website to our videos and find it there. So yeah, we want everybody to be able to access it whenever they want and share it with your friends and whoever you like. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, says Dean, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Bob, and thank you, Liz. This is such
You're
an
welcome.
interesting topic, and I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for everybody who joined us tonight. If you think of anything else or you want to get in touch with Bob or Liz, feel free to email me or call the office, and we're happy to connect you with them. And the recording, should be up, I would say, within the next week or so. So look for that if you want to rewatch this and invite your friends over for a movie night or something.
Oh, boy.
All right, very good. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.